Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, the podcast for writers who strive to be bold and readers who crave something new. I'm your host, Jonathan Ball. I want to thank you for being here, and I want us to stay in touch. So subscribe to this podcast, then go to writingthewrongway.com and enter your best email to receive the Martian Embassy Missive, my bi-weekly newsletter where I let you know what's happening on Mars, where we're always making big plans. Join the Martians so you don't get left out of the invasion at writingthewrongway.com. And as a special bonus, I'll send you a free book. Speaking of books, my new book is called The National Gallery, and it contains sonnets about Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, elegies lamenting the death of my iPhone, and other strange missives from yours truly, the Poet Laureate of Hell. Visit thenationalgallery.ca to order your signed copy. That's thenationalgallery.ca. So I'm talking to Ian Kinney, and he is the author of Air Salt, which is subtitled A Trauma Memoir as a Result of the Fall. And Ian, I'm wondering if you could just start with telling us a little bit about that subtitle, what that actually means and what the book is about.
Of course. Well, in 2008, I woke up in the hospital to the knowledge that I had jumped off a balcony and that I had fallen 7 stories. Ever since that, I've been sort of going through this process of trying to explore and examine what it was that could have happened. And in this trauma memoir, I try to share that process in writing.
Now, what I think is really interesting about this book, there's a couple of things that are really interesting to me about this particular book, but one thing I think that's just on a fundamental level interesting is that in some respects, I mean, it's poetry of a certain type, and it's investigating, this actual kind of event in your life. So you call it a trauma memoir. But there's a weird, interesting way in which I feel it is sort of a memoir in fragments and fractures and, collage together materials, but sort of an event that you don't really, remember or fully remember in any, real way. And so I just want maybe to start with that tension that to me seems to sort of structure the book. Where you're sort of writing about an event in your own life, which has had a massive impact on your life, and yet one that you don't really have access to in the sort of normal or traditional way that people think of having access to their autobiography or to their memoir memories. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that sort of tension or that maybe disorienting process and how that kind of fit into writing the book.
Well, I mean,
it's a big question, but
no, it's fine. Just considering the quality of this experience that I was endeavoring to document, something coherent and chronological, a narrative in that more traditional sense, seemed really inappropriate. If I talked about my injury and my recovery using linear prose from beginning to end, as I know other people who are writing memoirs often do, then I'd be submitting this memoir to constructs of storytelling, and I was unwilling, or perhaps unable, to really describe my experience using a work of prose. So I opted instead to write this creative process in a different style. I came to write it quite naturally as a collection of prose poems at first, using found material that I would then arrange in a style that was inspired by a work of language poets. So to accommodate for this absence of this sort of self-reflective autobiographical narrator, I call this writing in my memoir from other existing texts. So rather than describe this writing as sort of an intellectual resource for research, it becomes more of a creative, my found materials create material resources or sources for this creative process. So I wrote this memoir using a lot of found texts that I encountered around my injury, including my medical records, the get well soon cards, my all of the writing and correspondence between my friends and family about my recovery, all became sort of writing that I would source to help me talk about this thing.
Now, I was doing a degree at the University of Calgary around the same time you were. So if I remember correctly, you were an undergraduate when I was there doing my PhD. You hadn't quite entered the master's program, if I recall.
Yeah.
And at the time, if I remember right, you were working on a collage, a similar sort of collage text, or where you were using some sort of source materials, and you were mostly writing about zombies.
Yeah.
So I thought it was interesting because, of course, when I heard you had a book out, I immediately thought about the zombies. I thought, oh, Ian's finally finished his zombie book. But then when I saw this book, I thought, well, that's interesting because, of course, it makes sense that you would write about this. But I thought it was very curious that you're using a lot of the same techniques that you had been using, because on one hand, it of course made sense. I mean, that's the stuff you were doing and learning, and the kind of way you were writing. But in some ways, it seemed like it almost better suited this particular subject rather than the zombie material. But I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the zombie book you were writing before this, and kind of how maybe that type of writing you were engaged in kind of fed into this particular book.
It's a really great question. I sort of reinserting myself into university during my recovery was a huge challenge. I didn't really know how my brain injury would affect my studies or my ability to really compete in or engage in this academic world. And but thankfully, I had a fantastic mentor at the time, Christian Book. He took me on, and he was very, very generous in being able to give me sort of access points to get me back into writing. And I had already been writing this project, this zombie project, where I discovered that the newspaper was reporting events in ways that started to really resemble horror movies that I was watching and a fan of. So I would take the writing from the newspaper, and I would sort of rearrange it and cut it up to rewrite the newspaper to document the zombie apocalypse. It was a really fun, if not really exhausting, creative writing process. But it taught me a lot, actually, by transcribing the newspaper every day and by sourcing this horrific material. It was. In some ways, it could be argued it was one way for me to process the horrors that I was living through every day, but by sort of looking to the horrors that the outside world was sort of enduring, it helped me to really contextualize my own experience. But in another, it was a really great way to engage with text as materials, which eventually inspired the writing process behind Air Salt.
Now I remember when this accident happened because I was in Calgary at the time, and I remember visiting you in the hospital and bringing you some CDs of like stand-up comedy and stuff.
I still listen to those, actually. Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. But if I remember right, I brought just some Mitch Hedberg and some other things. But what I thought was a kind of just kind of looking back on it, what it was kind of an interesting odd thing about it when you start when I kind of look at this book. Like, this, I think a lot of people, when they kind of are thinking about writing about their life, for, good reasons, are thinking very much about themselves being the sort of narrator of their life. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? And I think what's kind of interesting about Air Salt is you've, in some respect, made all these other people, the sort of main mediators of your own experience. And there's ways in which you kind of have inserted yourself in there. You've got, for example, these poems where you've italicized certain words to kind of almost have a second poem inside of the first poem. And you've got, other things where, it seems very much like you're writing in the more or less in a first person. But I'm curious to know, like, and this even just harkens back to your zombie project before, any of this stuff had happened. I'm curious to know like what your attraction is to the idea of taking your own experience or your own kind of emotions, even like emotion like horror, reading the newspaper, say, your own kind of reactions, which normally are the things that people express in poetry, and instead kind of moving them in the background and kind of coming at everything in the second, third hand way, where you're kind of moving through or cycling through or just kind of collecting the voices of people. Like, what attracts you about that process of using found text?
Well, in large part, the process of this writing practice that where people are invited to writers and students of creative writing are invited to speak from themselves or from their own perspective and using their own voice was strange and disorienting to me because I didn't necessarily understand where or how this true, authentic voice could come from. It was because every time I was talking, I always felt like I was just reflecting the language that I had been taught, that the other people around me were using. I was communicating and in the best way that I knew how. And writing. The most engaging writing that I have found, the most accessible way for me to write, has always been to sort of take the writing that I encounter and to reframe it in a way that's more suited to my position and then reflect back. Considering the accumulation of found text that I use in Airsoft, can't really claim to have written this book entirely, but I prefer instead to compare it to sort of a kind of a process of orchestral composition, or sort of a continued fragmentation and rearranging of multiple texts. By including these multiple and other narrators, by using found poetry, I'm using the language of these other authors and usually enforcing this sort of arbitrary constraint to try to find a way to better express this position that I occupy as someone who's living with this traumatic brain injury, which in many ways interferes with this, I feel, my ability to recall things, my ability to express and describe and to cohere things in this linguistic format. Found writing just seemed like the most accessible and obvious route for me to express myself.
I feel it's almost cubist in a way, where as opposed to sort of looking at things in this single perspective, as you say, the kind of voice we're encouraged to develop as writers. In a sense, you're sort of almost manufacturing a voice in between the voices of you and others. It's almost like the text, I feel, is kind of almost speaking in a way. Or trying to get at somewhere between everybody's accounts of in this case this particular event that happened where you fell off this building or from this balcony. It seems to me like, as opposed to sort of trying to privilege a single position, you're sort of trying to get at this weird space between the positions where maybe the truth of the event lies, if we can say anything like that would exist. Is that fair to say, or is this something that you were always sort of interested in before, even when you were working on the zombie book and kind of other stuff before you began working on this?
Well, I can't say what I was up to before. Again, my memory is really distorted to that effect, but I can say that this sort of process of creative triangulation through multiple voices and multiple authors and various texts is definitely something that captures my imagination, because it does feel it feels to me like a more genuine and a more sort of scientific way, if I may be so bold, to try to identify some kind of essence of expression when there are multiple voices speaking towards the same event.
Do you think Sorry.
I'm just thinking here. Please continue.
Do you think that the process of being in the creative writing program and working on a project, as a sort of thesis project, to kind of defend it, as a sort of artistic project, played into your process at all?
Absolutely. If I was just writing this for myself, it would be very, very different in format. A lot of my education, I feel, was an exercise in formatting my thoughts and experiences so that it could be more accessible to a broader audience. A lot of my education was just figuring out how to, put things into MLA and to call my experiences and my writing and my incoherent ramblings into a more succinct and direct form of communication that I could offer to my supervisor or to my classmates or to my peers and colleagues. So this my education experience, my education was one that really challenged me to be as clear and direct with my use of language in ways that if I was just producing language for my own self-reflection, it would have been far less, I should say, accessible to an outside readership.
It's interesting for you to say that, because I feel very much the same way. That again, I went to Calgary, University of Calgary as well, and I felt very much that it was the same sort of experience where I was really being challenged to not just do my work, which you have a lot of pressure to actually do the work when you're in that kind of a program, but also to justify sort of how I was doing things and what I was doing. You say you were working with a Christian book, and then later you worked with Robert Magel's, and both of those people are very much, they both are very much. I'm trying to think of they're people who will demand that you articulate what it is that you're doing and why, right? And I've always found that's kind of was a valuable experience for me, and I feel it served me well. But I have talked to many people who find that, they're very kind of negative about that sort of scenario, or about that graduate school as a place that, they feel, again, kind of irons out their voice. I always felt that was in some ways the value of graduate school was kind of getting me beyond my own perspective and having to kind of think, as I say, kind of in a broader way about where I'm locating myself and what I'm doing and what other people are doing, and how can, I be part of a conversation as opposed to just sort of, talking to myself. So to me, the form of your book is really interesting in that respect as well, because I think you're quite literally inviting people in to express how they sort of feel about what happened to you, even more than, say, trying to express your own point of view.
Excuse me. I'm definitely resonating with this experience that you had in grad school, where it feels like you were being called to be held accountable to this writing that you were taking on, and then to situate it in this broader discourse, this conversation that was English literature or Canadian literature, and that pressure is definitely one that is felt by all students, I think, that go through the program, and that's those stressors can be quite overwhelming, and I know for many can feel quite oppressive. So yeah, the writing of Aerosol was one where I really wanted to call people in and help them recognize that this language that they're using to talk about a thing is just one of many voices, and if I can help to sort of situate and frame and sort of juxtapose these voices with this collage of other voices around a particular topic of conversation, then I can create conversation, or I can point towards the conversation that's occurring within a particular subject. And in the case of Aerosol, it was my recovery.
Now, I also really appreciate the way that you have included a lot of material that is sort of meta material, in the sense that you've got these voices reflecting on the text itself. So it seems clear that at some point you had given drafts of this to somebody, and then you'd gotten feedback from them, and then you'd started incorporating some of the feedback in. So on page 60, for example, you have, I don't know if a book-length work can sustain this many choppy excerpts. You've got lines like this, where it seems very much like somebody has read a version of this book and then given you some negative feedback. You just put that feedback into the book, or constructive criticism and whatnot. And so I'm curious to know if, could you talk a little bit about that process, how you wound up with material like that and incorporated it, and are these comments from Robert or what are they?
They're comments from Robert. They're comments from everyone who was in my creative writing workshop with Robert, and included a collection of other authors you may be familiar with. Holly Adams was the person who made that comment about the choppy excerpts. I know that Sandy Poole was also a part of that creative writing workshop. There was a number of others, and they all because Robert invited us to write process statements, and then everyone in that creative writing workshop was invited to respond to that process and to respond to the submission for that week. So it was again another exercise where we were being asked to sort of frame our not only our writing but also our response to the writing, and I used those responses and I sort of culled and collected them as more material for the book, which I thought was quite engaging and fun, because then it becomes this self-reflexive moment where the writing starts to talk about itself. But can you repeat your question again?
I just wanted to know that you answered the question. I just wanted to know a bit more about exactly where those things came from and kind of process and why you included them. The other sort of thing that kind of is interesting in terms of those meta textual moments is you've got these other lines that seem clearly from medical documentation, but also when of course they're put in the context of a poetry book, start to read like they're commenting on the poems. So you have on page 39 the line "patient does not make appropriate words," which of course must be source from medical documentation, but seems when reading the book to refer to the process of the poetry book. And I'm curious, when you were looking at this language, so now you're a poet, looking at language, you're looking over police records that you've requested under the Freedom of Information Act, if I am correct. You're looking at medical records that you're accessing in various ways. I want to know just a bit about the process of gathering these materials. Like, what did you actually do? So first off, what did you actually do to gather some of this material?
Well, the first thing I did, because I spent a lot of time in hospital waiting rooms, was I pocketed all of these brochures that they would take in, because the hospital is sort of saturated with this propaganda about either self-care, how to take care of yourself during your own recovery, how to understand your particular medical condition, how to seek help, things like this. And so I took all of that material and I took it home with me, because I thought at one point surely this would provide some basis for a poem. I'm glad that I did that, because eventually it did. And then during my graduate studies, it was brought to my attention that I could access my medical records through the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. So I approached a disclosure analyst and I requested my records, and there was some charge associated with that, but thankfully the Department of English was happy to fund the research, so I was able to access my medical records that way. But when you spend a couple months in the hospital, you accumulate a large amount of text. Every nurse's chart for the day, every doctor's notes, all of the X-rays, all of the CT scans were just this bulk of text that I eventually took home with myself. So that was part of my research process. I went through that, and I would identify sentences or phrases that felt appropriate or that just kept repeating themselves, that I could use to help write the book. The process was something that initially, when I started writing, I tried to exposit my experience using this more of a conventional storytelling, as I was talking about earlier, but it was just it felt contrived, it felt impossible. Using these records and just sort of manipulating the language to create poetry was just, again, felt more intuitive and natural to me. The process of revising it and revisiting it and then revising it and revisiting it is something that I've been doing since my master's thesis, and which I graduated in 2012, but then I submitted to the University of Calgary Press in 2018 or 2019. So it was this is something I've been processing and culling and cultivating and revisiting and editing for quite some time. It's the writing of this book is very much entangled in my own recovery process as I continue to reflect on and process this injury that I live with.
What was it like to go through that medical and legal material?
Super alienating. And then disorienting, just to see myself through the eyes of these medical practitioners. I became this sort of nameless figure that was just a 22-year-old right-handed native speaker of English. This was how I was sort of situated in this medical narrative, and those seem to be the most important characteristics of myself for them. And so that was just like how I came to be myself, as a 22-year-old right-handed native speaker of English, and just a patient number. Or just as a patient number, and my injury became the most defining characteristic of myself through the eyes of these medical professionals, and so that was really, really. I mean, like my identity was in many ways sort of supplanted by this medical jargon. So to revisit that again and again, I felt the need to resist against it if I could, and by culling and cultivating this poetry and then reflecting it back on itself, that was sort of an attempt to sort of subvert and to parody that language if I could.
And what was it like to kind of just see the mass of text, as you say, that's kind of relating to yourself, but not really have the same coordinates that maybe, to kind of process it? Like, I guess the question maybe more cleanly would be, when you're looking at all that material and kind of this, how much language just attaches itself to a person, was there a way in which you felt that this was a method of getting control of that material, or did you feel like this was a way of making it, like, undoing controls that the language was maybe trying to place?
Well, that makes total sense, because I feel like in many ways it could be described as having engaged in both of those strategies to sort of take control of myself through this language and to sort of undermine that language by manipulating it and distorting it as I do. Because I don't know. The language of a medical practitioner is one that's focused explicitly on the pathology of the thing, and I know that I'm more than that, and I know that my experiences and this person that I am extends beyond just those collection of symptoms that are relevant for treatment in those cases. So it was really important to me that I look beyond and outside of the medical narratives, because that authority and that meta narrative was one that I was trying to break away from. So I often include these correspondences between my friends and my lovers and my family as they're talking about me during my recovery. That language was far more personal and far more intimate in ways that allowed me to gain different perspectives and to introduce new voices into the writing. The Get Well Soon cards that I received, for example, all provided these really sentimental moments that were in stark contrast to this medicalized sort of distancing that I experienced through the doctors and nurses' charts.
I find that anytime you have two types of language like that are in some formal contrast, so as you say, kind of very sentimental language versus totally unsentimental language, but anytime there's a contrast in language like that, I feel like it's a fertile ground for poetry, because so much to me of what poetry is a tension between these sort of two types of these two things happening. And so I'm wondering a little bit about your process, like just if you could just kind of drill right down to precisely how you might actually put a poem together when you're kind of working in this way. So, because this is a fairly unusual way to work in the sense that, most people just kind of think of a thing and write it down, right? But you're doing a different process. It's very much a collage process in some respects. You're very much taking, you've got a very narrow set of found text in a manner of speaking, but there's still a lot of material there that you're going through, and then you're kind of making decisions about how to excerpt things, how to put it together, and so on. So I just want to walk a little bit through that process for writers who are listening to this and who
absolutely
maybe want to know a bit more about how to do that. So number one, when you first decided to kind of do something, maybe you didn't have clearly an idea for the book at this point, but you decided to really start working on some sort of project with this material. How did you decide what material you were going to look at versus what material you were going to exclude?
Very good question. The first sort of step in this process, as I mentioned before, was just sort of the collecting of text, pocketing those hospital brochures, gaining access to my medical records, collecting all of those Get Well Soon cards, not throwing them away as my mother would otherwise have preferred. I accumulated them, and how I was able to sort through them was I took on this sort of arbitrary constraint. I said that I'm going to write this book in a series of sections. And in each section, there's going to be a different number of voices speaking, or a different number of texts that I include in that particular poem. So in the first section, I'm only going to write a poem using text from a particular found source. Whereas in the second section, I'm going to include voices or text from two sources, or there'll be two speakers in that particular poem. And then in the third section of the book, I'll start to combine language from three different sources, and so on and so forth, until the seventh and final section, where I'm including and combining writing from 7 found texts, or 7 different sort of speakers, are all sort of coming together in a kind of a chorus. And it was really interesting to see how those voices would sort of collude and combine through this creative writing exercise, where I was trying to rearrange this writing again and again and again. So it was very systematic and sort of step by step, and it was the best, a really helpful way for me to approach this mass.
It's interesting that you say systematic to describe that process, because it does very much sound like a systematic process, but as you also noted, it begins with a kind of arbitrary set of decisions. I'm just going to do this, and then like you're going to do that very systematically. I think that's a good strategy that a lot of people don't do, which is to just decide on doing something. I see so often people will try to find the perfect system for how they're going to approach a project, and they will, as a result, keep procrastinating the project. And what I always find is useful is just to start with an arbitrary thing that gets you going, and then start to slowly systematize it, or even just come up with a again arbitrary system and do that, because of course you could always change things later. Did you keep that system in any way, or did you switch that? Because I don't see the book divided into sections in a clean way. I mean, maybe.
It was my master's thesis was more cleanly divided into sections. I was able to divide these sections quite explicitly using images of my hematoma, or my brain injury, that sort of served as an erasure of this language that I would encounter in my medical records. So it was more explicit in my master's thesis, or the creative component of my master's thesis, these sections. But as I went on to revise and revisit and rewrite this process, the sections began to sort of dissolve into one another, and things started to get a little bit rearranged and disordered. But you're right. The impulse to develop a system was by itself quite arbitrary. Like, why 7 sections? Why 7 voices? Well, I guess because I felt 7 stories, and 7 is a really fun number to play with. But there were, of course, many more voices and sources of text than that.
7 is also a biblical number, and you've got this biblical, allusion, the fall, and so maybe as a side note, it'd be interesting to know to what degree you see yourself playing with that idea.
I don't see any biblical references or inspirations in the composition of this book.
I don't see much in the book itself. Just the subtitle, and the number 7 kind of just brings it to mind. But I was wondering if there was stuff hidden in there that I wasn't aware of.
Not intentionally, no. I mean, I was raised Christian, but I certainly didn't extract from those teachings or that theology when I was writing this book. It was something that I took on from my studies of creative writing and English literature.
Now, once you had this sort of 7-section approach, you've got this kind of systematic way that you're going to kind of move through the composition of the book. How did you go about actually then pulling excerpts? So when you're actually looking through the material, so now you selected down to here's the material I'm going to look at. Here's the sort of number of voices I'm going to have in each section. But then when you're looking through the material and pulling things out, what were the kinds of things that you were looking for? It's like, what kind of made you pull a piece of text? Like, what are the kind of qualities you were seeking?
Well, I learned a lot from that creative writing project that I took on with Christian, where I went through the newspaper and I was trying to identify the most emphatic or horrific writing that the news was using to talk about the events that it was reporting on. And then, so when I was keeping an eye out there, I was like, what in this particular news article sounds like it could be from a horror movie? What are the most, where is that language doing the most work? Where is it trying to scare me? Where do I feel that there's that energy? And so when I go through my medical records, I'm looking for just this sort of energy. Like where do I feel affected? Like there's so much here, and there's so much statistics, and they're just so depersonalized that when I go through and I find something that's just like there's an emotional tenor there. You can tell that there's something that speaks to me, or that was either speaking to or through the writer in that moment. So I'm going through with a sensitivity and a sense of empathy of what I'm feeling, or what I feel this author might be experiencing. So it's a really emotional. I'm going through this material with an eye for, and a sort of or my heart. I don't know how to describe it than like what's affecting me. And so then I take those moments and then I collect those because they're the shining language moments. There's something interesting happening in there that I can revisit and then potentially use to write the poems later on. So there's a lot of sort of sifting through and identifying and reading and rereading and being like, ooh, that's a good one. And by bringing, I didn't always have that sensitivity. Part of the reason my creative writing workshops were so helpful is because my colleagues were able to identify the most emphatic and emotional moments for them. And I was just like, oh, that's great advice, thanks. And I would take those and focus on those moments more.
It's interesting that you're looking for sort of emotional moments or moments that kind of cause an emotional reaction, but yet you're looking predominantly a text that is designed precisely to not inspire emotional reactions. So it's interesting to me because it's an example of sort of what something I think fundamentally poetry is good for, which is kind of taking language and making it do things that it's not meant to do, using it wrong, in a manner of speaking. Very much that kind of defamiliarization technique that Shklovsky talks about in his old essay, and that's something I think that I certainly learned a lot from Christian himself, and the other, and Robert and Suzette Meir was my main mentor in that writing program and the person I did the manuscript course with. But Majels and Christian were also on my committee, and I got a lot of feedback from them when I was, going to school there. And they all kind of have different approaches, but I think one thing that they have in common is that way in which they're kind of sort of interested in this language that maybe is being used in an unusual manner, or to do things that is sort of not meant to do, or to twist it in kind of ways where it could refer to something that it's not intended to refer to. What I see a lot in this book is this medical, especially medical and police procedural language, where it seems like it's talking about the process of writing the book. Although it's of course intended is talking about you as a patient, your inability to use words or in the right context, which of course is a weakness in terms of trying to recover from a brain injury, and a thing they're trying to kind of get you out of, trying to make you like normalize your language abilities in a manner of speaking to so that you can improve communication and articulate more cleanly and without the possibility of confusion. But once we come to the realm of poetry, all those same quote-unquote weaknesses are now strengths. Miscommunicating becomes a sort of value, an artistic value in poetry. And saying a thing in a way where it could mean multiple things instead of just one single thing. So all of a sudden your clear communication goes out the window, but you have this broader deeper sort of possibility for communicating or expressing ideas. So I'm curious to know a little bit of your thoughts on that tension. That, like, how is it to actually be in a recovery process where, on one hand, you're trying to, normalize your ability to communicate with language, and then also as a poet, you're trying to, not normalize and really delve into this kind of abnormal way of communicating with language. Like, what was that sort of experience of moving back and forth like?
Well, I feel like that tension is most clearly expressed in my master's thesis, where there's a creative component and a critical component. And in the critical component, I'm doing my very best to provide this survey of a particular topic and to explore it and present it from this very academic and scholarly lens. So the challenge for me there was to be as coherent and as clear and accountable to my process as I could be. Whereas in my creative process, I was my invitation was to, again, play with these language moments to make things more new and interesting, and clarity what might not necessarily be the primary objective in that context. So the process of making the language strange is really, again, something that I was working with throughout this, and I recognized as I started to borrow this language that certain metaphors started to sort of occur. That whereas specifically the image of the cast and the image of the broken bone and the image of my own severed spinal cord became metaphors for this coherence of not only my own body but also this body of work that I was accumulating, and how this sort of fractures that occur within the text resemble or reflect the fractures that occur within my body, and how this sort of formal process of combining it and bringing it and cohering it into a particular verse resembles a kind of process of casting these fragments and hoping that something sticks. It's a really organic process, and at the same time very, very informed through a process of structure and repetition. And the idea of repeating things was really inspirational for me in writing this, because one of the most effective methods to rehabilitate in any context is just to keep trying. If you can't walk today, you try walking again tomorrow. If you take one step today, you take 2 steps again, and you just keep doing it. And you keep taking the same methods and the same motions again and again, and progressively, eventually, you'll be able to run. And eventually I was, which was really important for my own recovery. And I took the same sort of methodology, applied it to this writing process, and these phrases, these sentences and phrases would repeat themselves. This idea of being able to focus, this idea of having this image of this cast, this idea of having a spinal cord that was fractured, that it was having to realign itself, the opportunities for mobility that gave license to, was all the more that I revisited that language, the more that I was able to recycle those turns of phrase, the more interesting they became. I was able to, no repetition was ever the same. There was always some kind of growth or some sort of novelty that I was continuing to express and explore the longer and the more frequently that I came back to this phrase. Some phrases repeat themselves again and again, and I don't feel like any phrase is ever saying the same thing twice.
Did you feel this book, this project, was important in your recovery?
Truly, it's part of my recovery. And it has been since the beginning. When I was collecting those brochures in the waiting rooms, to even when I was working on that zombie project with Christian, that was developing skills that I would later use to help me write this book. And throughout my graduate studies, I was always working on air salt, even though it wasn't called air salt at the time. And even now that air salt's published, I'm still writing, I'm still revising, and I'm taking these poems and I'm erasing them. I'm peeling back more and more of this extraneous material, and I'm getting more to this sort of essential expression, because the poems are starting to speak by themselves, it seems it's really quite uncanny to see what sorts of voices are coming together and through this language, and through that, I learned something about not just this writing, but also recovery itself.
Well, thanks so much for talking to me, Ian, and I appreciate it. And people should really check out Air Salt. That's the name of the book, Air Salt: A Trauma Memoir as a Result of the Fall by Ian Kinney. So I'll post links to where people can find more information about that up at writingthewrongway.com. And I just want to thank you again, Ian, for writing this book, and congratulations on finishing it. A book is always an accomplishment, but I feel like this, is an especially significant accomplishment for you, given the real difficulties I can only imagine, trying to put this project together.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It means a lot hearing that from you, because during my undergrad I looked to you as one of those authors who's publishing all of this interesting work and who was constantly engaging in their community and talking about writing, and those are important conversations, and I'm really grateful that I was able to bear witness to them, and now just with you being able to speak to that and to reflect on that, and you've taught me a lot, and I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity to reflect on this now, and thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks very much, and we'll talk again soon, I hope. Have a great day, Ian.
You too. Take care.